Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We've got a very special guest today, Andrew Klavan, from Young Heretics, which I don't know if that's like kind of a dig at the Young Turks, which would be pretty funny to be honest, and author of multiple books, Gateway to the Stoics, and the latest one, How to Save the West. How's it going?
It's great, thanks. I should say my name is Spencer. Andrew's
Oh
my
God,
dad.
damn it! I knew I was going to do that. Like, you know, when you're like, I hope I don't do that, and then you think about it for 10 minutes, like, all right, I'm going to call him his right name, and then you immediately call him the wrong name. I played myself. I played myself. I've met your dad before. Dad's a good guy. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I'm honored to be confused for him, and we like to joke that we're not related to one another, so it's weird that people keep calling me by his name. It's very strange. But you're not the first person.
I'm sure I'm not. Yeah. Anyway, so I talk about this. It's interesting that we've finally run into each other because I've read a lot of your, or I haven't read the books, but I've read a lot of your writing and kind of followed some of the video stuff you do as well. And it's always interesting to me the way that people in the West seem to figure out a way to unsolve problems on a regular basis that we've solved a very long time ago. And I don't know if it's just like, boredom, you know, or if it's hubris or laziness or what it is. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, you used the word that the ancient Greeks would have used to talk about it, and that's hubris. It's a Greek word. It means overweening pride. And I think we can add a little bit of complacency into that as well. This idea that, you know, you set everything up well, and when things start going well as a result, there creeps in this kind of forgetfulness, this idea that it all dropped out of the sky, or you did it all for yourself. You don't stand on the shoulders of giants. There's nobody before you that matters. And there's a version of this in the Bible as well, right before the Jewish people enter into the promised land. God says to them, okay, everything's going to be great now, and you're going to eat, you know, the fruits of your field and drink the wine from your vines, and then your heart will say, my hand, my strength did all of this, and you will forget the Lord your God. And so remember. We need reminding every few generations or so. I mean, the modern version of this is, you know, hard times make strong men make good times make weak men make bad times. And this is, you know, the ancient idea of anacyclosis, the cycle of regimes. I just think it's part of our fallen nature. We get complacent, we get proud, and most of all, we forget the ones that came before us, which is kind of the work of my life, is to remind people that we stand at the end of this vast and excellent tradition that we still, even now, even at this late hour, we can still reach into it for wisdom and guidance.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think I've always kind of thought that's what Jefferson meant when he said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. I'm not entirely sure he just meant war. He wasn't a very warlike man, so it's hard to assume that he meant that we needed a violent revolution every 15 years, right? But
that's interesting. Yeah.
The idea of like kind of wiping the maybe you would call it the peripheral institutional knowledge that gathers over time, and a big part of that is people starting to take credit for things that existed long before them, right? I think maybe that there's something at play there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you could add the sweat of patriots and tyrants as well. I think I've never thought about that Jefferson quote quite that way, but I think you must be right, because this is a country that's seen a number of revivals, even in our kind of relatively short history, in part because our system, our republic, depends on the religious spirit of the people, the morality of the people, which is a living thing. It's not something you can just set in stone and one and done, and then it's over. You do need to kind of refresh. You need to go back to the source. And I suspect that our founders knew we would have to do this over and over again. I mean, another element of this is simply that as times change, you know, new technology comes up, new situations emerge. Because the human heart is a factory of idols, we're always trying to answer new questions with the answers from, you know, the last political battle. We're always fighting yesterday's war, essentially. And as time goes on, I think we need to return to the wellspring of some of these traditions because they will give us sort of new answers to meet new challenges. So the digital revolution is a perfect example of this, right? You've got this technology that has totally disoriented us, reconfigured the way we talk to one another, the way we relate, the way we relate to ourselves, understand our place in the universe. And we think that that means, oh, well, it's so new that nobody's ever thought about this stuff before. But actually, what's happening is we're being thrown back on ancient questions that have been around for a long time, basic things like, what's my place in the cosmos? Is there a God? And that's kind of good news from my perspective, in part because it means we're not alone. It means that there have been people around before us who've thought about those questions for a long time. There are sane and good answers available to us. And the only thing keeping us from accessing them is this idea that, once the past has handed its standards down to you, you can convict the past based on those ideals. So the founders, they were insufficiently, egalitarian. It's like, well, who taught you to be egalitarian? Like the founders did. And so, yeah, these ideals don't come dropping out of the sky, perfectly embodied at the moment they're thought of. But, guess what? Like you and I don't perfectly embody those ideals either. And the woke harpies certainly don't perfectly embody those ideals. They have to be lived out gradually over time. And they're precious that way. You have to recover them.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't really we don't criticize physicists for their experiments being rudimentary or being captured by or limited by the technology of their time. But for some reason, we do this philosophically quite a bit, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And to your other point about what people would call getting back to the basics, this is kind of a fundamental rule that applies to any kind of skill, whether it be just living your life or a work skill or language skill. The one I like most is a sports analogy. Like if you're a hitter at baseball and your swing's all fucked up, you don't go out and take batting practice and try to hit as many home runs as you can. You get back to the basics. Typically, you break your swing down into smaller increments and make sure you're getting each one of those correct first, and then you build from there. But for some reason, well, it's not for some reason. It's the ADD culture, I guess, has been strung along a lot by technology, but I think it's deeper than that. I think that we've lost the internal relationship between effort and consequence, right? We expect results, but the effort consequence paradigm has been lost on us entirely. You know what I mean? Like people just don't have any tolerance for that anymore.
Well, you see that even in the way we talk about money, right? We have this kind of imaginary idea about money that it's disconnected from, you can sort of abstract it away from any hard value like land or livestock or whatever that money symbol represents, whatever actual value it's being exchanged for. And so now we're in this position, racking up just absolute Looney Tunes numbers in terms of debt. And we have actual serious economists going out there with their faces hanging out and saying, oh, it doesn't actually matter. You can just sort of like magic money into the ether. And that's, the consequence, I think, of a civilization that is so developed that the effort consequence chain is really, really long. And so for a while, it gets easy to think like, oh, yeah, actually, I never have to meet with the consequences of my actions because they're way, way over there, or they're totally, they run through all these complicated steps. But the reality, of course, as you say, is that those basics never go away. If there's some little thing that's wrong in your baseball swing, if your elbow is like a millimeter off or whatever, and you thought that you had that kind of covered, so you forget about it, you stop looking at it, eventually somewhere down the line, it's going to come out in a really big problem. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, quotes Aristotle on this point. He says a small error in the beginning makes a big error in the end. He's talking about logic and arguments, but it's true everywhere. It's like you start with this little tiny crack and it grows and grows until finally you're totally screwed.
Yeah, it's I like that breakdown of the immensity of some of the numbers we play around with. And I don't think, like these days with, if you're thinking about the size of the universe or the U.S. national debt, those numbers are so large that people feel kind of disconnected from them. And it reminds me of that quote, if you kill a man, you're a murderer. If you kill millions of men, you're a conqueror. You know what I mean? It's like we have this bizarre disconnect between the immensity of something and our, I guess maybe our effect or responsibility towards it. Maybe I don't know how you would really categorize that, but it's something that we're in this new period now, right? For the last 100 years, 150 years or so, people have access to information more than they did before. states and the church did a pretty good job of, especially the church, keeping the Bible in Latin until until the early part of the 16th century, to make sure that they had a monopoly on access to God, for example, right? And then there was a lot of people tried for being heretics for studying science after that. But now it's very difficult, as much as even our U.S. government tries to hide things from us. It's very difficult to keep information out of people's hands these days. And I wonder, from your perspective, as somebody who is, I mean, what I see now for the most part is just regurgitated bullshit most of the time. Everybody wants a hot take on something. And look, I don't need to know what a musician's take on politics is, frankly. And we never would have cared before. But now there's this virtue bank that everybody has to put deposits into, and if you don't, then you're not part of the good people group. You know what I mean? So I wonder.
Yeah. I mean,
elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, you mentioned my podcast, Young Heretics, and my book, How to Save the West. I think this stuff is kind of interesting to me because, I don't know, I'm kind of a nerdy dude. I like reading old books, and I started out talking about this. Obviously, when you talk, you're talking to people, you're hoping people listen. But I was pretty at peace with the idea that my subject was pretty niche, and I would just get among a group of people that really liked it, and that would be great. And I had no idea what hunger there is out there for somebody to talk meaningfully about real stuff, like rather than this garbage that's constantly getting thrown at us about like fake invented problems. The like vanishingly small percentage of people that suffer from gender dysphoria now are going to become like a national referendum, right? And we're going to have like a big firefight over it every 5 seconds. People are desperate for somebody to say, this is the basically reality. We all can kind of see it, even though there's, fuzziness around the edges. And here's some rich wisdom about how to engage with it, which is what you get out of the ancient text. So you're absolutely right. I mean, our media ecosystem is really interesting, delicate, strange, infuriating at times, but very similar to the period you mentioned, which comes along, let's not forget, with the invention of the printing press, right? I mean, it's that technology that leads to a lot of the changes you described, or enables those changes, making scripture widely available to people in their own language, and those things go hand in hand. And now we have this new technology which does something very similar for news and data and information. You can suddenly see behind the curtain of all these things that previously were hidden, behind the TV studio. And just as, during the era of the printing press, the church made a very serious effort, the Catholic Church made a very serious effort to exert control over what was printed. And not just the church, by the way, governments also, especially, governments in Europe. We have an almost identical movement, an almost identical situation when it comes to digital technology. If you read like Twitter's, before Musk took it over, some of the things that Twitter was saying about the way that they watched over people and would kick them off the platform, including the sitting president, right? Some of those things sound exactly like the statements of the papacy during the era of the printing press. And so you're in a struggle, right? You're in a struggle between the force of the tech, which does one thing, kind of opens up this floodgate of information for good and ill, and the reaction of the ruling classes, which is to shut it down, to drill harder into control. And that's part of the reason that they're freaking out so hard right now. But it's also a reason that I personally have no room really for despair, because ruling classes always represent themselves as unbeatable, eternal. You can never possibly go up against these power structures. But that they only say that when they realize that you're actually in a moment where basically anything could happen. The good guys definitely could win if, in fact, we reach out to one another using this tech and talk about stuff that matters.
Yeah, sure. I say this all the time, but people get really confused these days because we've had this idea of a binary political system for a very long time, and then you see members of the varying parties working together towards what seems to be more control over the American population, and people use the phrase uniparty now in a surprising way. They're like, I can't believe this happened. It's like, well, this is what always happens, right? The aristocracy will protect itself before any particular principle. It'll protect itself, right? I really do enjoy that comment you made. about all the flood of information, I guess, if you want to call it that now, that's readily available to people.
Yeah.
Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say that we have smartphones, but we're not any smarter for it. You know, like we have smartphones and dumb
Right.
people maybe, but
Right.
it is interesting. Like I feel like because all this stuff has been exposed now about how, political and aristocratic classes have recently and then historically captured any kind of modality of communication or
Mm.
modality of even thought, to be honest. And now
Mm.
people have become cynical, and having an having an absent epistemology to appeal to, where we don't know
Mm.
what the where's true north exactly anymore. That's a very dangerous time for people, because intellectual anarchy is not a good thing, I don't think. And I don't mean to say we
No.
should have control over what people think, but I mean to say there should be guardrails for what is reality and what is not reality. And that's why we have this 2 + 2 = 5 bullshit going on.
Totally, totally. Well, one thing it does is it makes signal cut through the
Mm,
noise a lot clearer. You think about AI, for instance, right? Everybody's talking right now about ChatGPT and DALL-E and all those platforms that just generate like kind of churned out machine-based words, essentially. And everybody's like, well, is this going to mean that a lot of people are going to lose their jobs in the knowledge industry? And my feeling is like probably, but not for the reasons that you think. Like you think that this AI is going to become a conscious human, but it's not. It's actually just revealing how much of the language that was already out there basically could have been written by a machine. Like
mm.
how much garbage there is, emails that come into your inbox every day, press releases that come out of the White House, like stuff that is just like so predictable, rote, kind of weirdly anti-human. Like it sounds like it was kind of cooked up in a lab. It's like there is a lot of that stuff out there already being produced by humans, and those people are now just like in a wash of text produced by robots. And then if you actually read something that has real human feeling and spirit, suddenly you can see it so much more clearly because everything else is just such trash. And I think, similarly about somebody like Jordan Peterson, let's say, right, who's saying something which in another time it might not have been as successful to say like clean your room to
Mm.
people, but he's cutting through this enormous just wash of BS, garbage, nonsense, like whatever, and psyops, stuff that just is designed to scoop your brain out with a melon baller. And somebody stands up and says you should clean your room, and here's why. It's like, wow, that actually really hits all of a sudden. And I think there's that potential too for like signal to cut through the noise.
Yeah, sure. That reminds me of Tim Wu's book, The Attention Merchants. He kind of lays out how
Mm.
American politics in the early part of the 20th century borrowed all of their once radio and print were widely circulated. They borrowed most of
Yeah.
their campaigning strategies from the snake oil salesmen of the latter part of the 19th century, right? That is to say,
Huh. Yeah.
very quick, quippy one-liners that casually accuse people of things or casually assert things about themselves without really having any substance to it, right? It's almost like a throwaway
Yeah.
tweet, you know what I mean? Where you can complain
Yeah.
about it, like, oh, I just said that in a moment. That's not that big a deal, but it is a big deal because you broadcast it to 30 million people. You know what I mean? It feels a
Totally.
lot. It feels a lot like that because in the same way that we use MSG and fillers to get people addicted to food, or these app companies use micro transactions to keep people addicted to the little video game app things. It's the same thing, right? We're just kind of baiting people along, and we have this flood of information. We're constantly stimulated, but we don't actually learn anything. And I would be very curious to see what, if any, change there's been in the average person's memory capabilities over the last 30 years or so. I think that would be very interesting because I'm not sure that people actually remember things anymore. I think maybe they make maybe little hash marks in their brain, like, oh, I remember something about that, but I don't really. Because if you, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, but you used to have to memorize everybody's phone numbers. Otherwise, you just didn't have them,
Oh,
you know?
yeah.
And
Totally.
that's,
One,
I don't
two.
think that's a thing anymore.
No, I think somebody said you can tell how old a person is based on how many phone numbers they have memorized, and
Yeah.
that's right. I mean, yeah, I I'm here to tell you that people's memories are not doing well. And this is another thing, I do this little thing every month on Twitter. I memorize a poem and I just like have people do it along with me. And it's like, again, this would just be normal, boring stuff like in any other context. You like in the Victorian era, in the 1800s, like you would not find it remarkable that there's some guy out there memorizing poems. But why does that captivate now? It's because people's brains are so scrambled and so amorphous. Like there's no foothold. People have nowhere to grasp and say like, okay, so this basic principle, that's true, so I can build on that. That's that epistemological framework I think you were describing that's missing. And to be fair, Plato, the great Greek philosopher, made the same complaint about the technology of writing. He said, like, once people write things down and you get this like papyrus that you can keep stuff on, well, people aren't going to remember stuff as much anymore. And there's some truth to that. I mean, you always outsource something to a machine whenever you create it. But there's also, I think, there are baseline facts about us, about human beings, that make it kind of impossible to ever really thrive or flourish totally in a machine world. Like, we are a certain kind of thing. The Aristotelians would say we have a telos, a purpose, and it involves like living in embodied life. It's like, what does it matter if there's a machine somewhere that knows everything, right? We have these vast computer databases, and we know that somewhere out there is every piece of information. But it's like that machine doesn't actually know the thing. Like, that machine is not sitting and thinking and having that experience of that knowledge. So it actually only matters if you go out and get that information and process it, and it changes you some way. Like, that's kind of, I think, what people are losing is ownership, personal ownership over the facts and truth that are totally available to them. And there's no substitute, there's no solution to that except taking a certain amount of human initiative, willpower, right? To say, like, actually, no, we're not going to, just because we have this ability to do all these many things, like, we're not going to do everything with them that we could. We're not going to, for instance, hack up children and like rearrange their body parts just because we have like the surgical tools to do it. There's no substitute. People feel like it's inevitable that, like, oh, these machines are just going to kind of wash over us and destroy our brains, but it's not inevitable. That's a use of technology. That's not the nature of technology in itself. And like, there's no substitute here for actual willpower and discipline, which does actually feel better than like relaxing back into the Zoom cloud. Like, it actually, any athlete knows that effort feels better than laziness, but it does take that activation energy.
Well, it's the difference between dopamine and serotonin, right? I mean, if you get something quickly, like if I order something on Amazon and it shows up in 2 hours and I have it now, that's dopamine. If I go out and work for it, build it myself or whatever, then that's serotonin. It's the difference between a short and long burn, right? And look, there's uses for both of those things, frankly, but if you're terribly dependent on dopamine, then you're always chasing, right? You're always chasing it. You're not building anything. And I think that's the problem. We're the chasing part, that's a hunter-gatherer feature. We live in societies now. We farm, you know what I mean? And it's the way our brains developed over time. We decided that it was better, safer, more productive to live in one place with the same people, protect that place and work the land, right? But instead, these days, we just move to a new city and start a new job, or we get divorced and we go on to a new family or whatever it is. And it's the results are very obvious. I don't know that you could really. I haven't seen any data personally that would convince me that short-term things outweigh long-term things. I don't think that is the way human beings work, frankly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is why, like, the number one most effective philosophical question in the world right now is, how's that working out for you? I mean, maybe in another era, like, there would be other important questions to ask, but right now people say these things that make absolutely no sense. Like, I mean, I've said this before, but like, a man can be a woman, makes no sense. 2 + 2 = 5 makes no sense. Like, the right and wrong are just matters of perspective. We know these things aren't true. It's all just, atoms bouncing off in a void. I saw somebody the other day saying, like, did you know that we're just a rock among a billion stars and none of this matters? It's like, that's obviously a false statement, like that. And so the real question is, like, how is that working out for you? If you think that, if you believe that, what's your life looking like right
Sure.
now, not in some imagined utopian future where, like, if we just push hard enough, like do enough COVID lockdowns, then death will be over and there'll be no more suffering. Like, right at this moment, how's it working out for you to spend your 100% of your life like inside of a 8 by 10
Mm-hmm.
box and like listening to everything that the safety gurus tell you? Like, it's not working well for people, and they know it. And the more you kind of confront them with that, the more sort of I think opportunity there is for people to realize that these things just don't work. They've not been working. Older ideas work better in a lot of cases, and infinite liberty, infinite freedom is actually not the like be all and end all of the American or the human ideal. Like, we believe in personal liberty, but there's actually more than that. It takes more than that to build a society.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's again, liberty, like anything else, is a tool, right? I mean, it's
Sure.
like technology. It's something that you get to decide what to do with it. And this it's kind of the premise of the show. I feel like you can, you know, do what most folks do these days, which is bitch and moan about your rights or your plight, and then stand by and wait for the state or somebody else to secure those rights for you, or you can, take upon yourself the responsibilities required of you to get sustain those rights in the first place, and that makes you a citizen, and the former makes you a subject under rule. And I don't
Right.
think most people are at least in the United States, they used to not be comfortable with being ruled. Now I feel like they're getting quite a bit more comfortable with it. And I think one of the other things you said, it isn't a judgment. It's not a moral judgment to say that old things are typically better. Some people get really upset about that. Like, who are you to tell me what to do? It's like, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what works. That's not the same thing,
Right.
People try to moralize every issue, and that's not what I'm trying to do. I don't think, for example, that it is immoral for a woman to choose not to be a mother and to work on her career instead. But I do think that it's very obvious that there's a price to pay for anyone for ignoring your biological programming. There's a price to pay for that. It almost incontrovertibly turns to nihilism at some point in your life because you're not doing the things that you're supposed to do. Now, look, some people can't even have children. That it is the way it is. But if you drill down to the root of that issue, what is it exactly about being a mother aside from all the biological stuff that fulfills a woman's sense of purpose? And there's a lot of ways to answer that question, right? I mean, being empathetic, protecting your young, developing your teaching your young, things like that. There's a lot of ways to do that without being an actual mom, I suppose. But if you aren't drilling down into those things and trying to understand what your biological, some people might even say spiritual purpose, though I'm not particularly religious or anything, but not that you would need to be. I don't know that I personally go that far, but I think it's something that you should definitely look into. So I talk to people about this a lot, particularly about veteran suicide. Over the last 20 years or so, we've treated this issue as if there are broken people coming back that need to be fixed. And, from time to time, that's correct. But I understand where it comes from, the empathy to pat them on the back and say everything's going to be okay, and all the platitudes that we do there. And some of them are not just platitudes. People go out of their way to try to help heal people who have been through traumatic experiences like that. But that's not what warriors need. Warriors need the next job to do, right? I need the next purpose. That's what I need. That's how you heal. That's why I love the funny kind of meme or trope about the dad who falls in love with the animal that he never wanted. It's like that. There's your evidence. That is your evidence right there. Like, he didn't necessarily want that thing, but as soon as it comes under his protection, his sense of purpose is reignited, and he feels fulfilled as a human being. And look at how he interacts with this cat that he doesn't even like. You know what I mean? He immediately resumes his purpose as a provider and a protector, and he enjoys it. But whether he wanted to or not, he enjoys it. And that is the biological programming that we've decided to ignore because we're so fucking progressive. We're so smart. We're so much smarter than nature. You know what I mean? And I guess
And
it's
we're
just
so nice and good. We
it's
know so much.
it's just hubris
so
again,
smart.
right? It's always that.
Right. Well, I mean, the other thing, and this is part of what you're talking about, I think, is like we've suddenly started to take offense when people talk about like the majority, when people talk about what works for most people
Yeah,
who are normal, right?
normal means average. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
good or bad. It just means most people do that thing. That's all that means, dude. I don't know why people get so butthurt about that.
Well, totally. Well, because it's like, they're first of all, a lot of things that are normal are really good. Like it's really great to be a
Mm,
to be a normal person. Like this
mm,
is actually, when you hear talk about like, normativity, it's like as if you're somehow imposing upon the world your insistence that like absolutely everybody be like white, straight, two kid, family owning, whatever, like all these things that are supposed to be so evil. It's like, okay, well, so not everybody is those things, but those
mm,
things are great things to be. In fact, a lot of them make society run. So, like, what is the like rage, the fury about it? Well, it has to do, I think, with the fact that it's like, we're all outside the norm a little bit. Everybody's got something that makes him a little bit like kooky or
mm.
eccentric. And when you organize society around normies, around normal people, there's always going to be like dissatisfactions for the people that have something, a little bit off. I mean, even just to the extent of like, I'm a writer. There are people who are like, violinists, concert pianists. And it's like
Mm.
the world isn't made for people to do that, because if everybody did that, you would not have a very healthy or successful society. So it's like, yeah, there's certain things that you have to accept if you want to live in a world that's made for 99% of the people. And you can't like demand, feel entitled for the world to cater to everything about you, every niche, minor aspect of your identity as you endlessly navel gaze into the small ways that you're special. It's like that's not how society actually works. Society succeeds if you pay attention first and foremost to what the vast majority of people at most times and places do. They get married, they have
Mm.
kids, they go to work, they do these things that are like, as you say, those things work. They conduce to happiness, they lead to happiness for like most people most of the time. And it's not like an insult to say that, even if it turns out that like some people, yeah, aren't going to live a life that looks exactly like that. Like telling a woman, like most women tend to, find fulfillment in homemaking and motherhood, isn't an insult to her if it turns out that actually she's like, the one woman that like should be at the head of
Mm.
a Fortune 500 company. You're just telling her like, look, most people most of the time live this way. And if you don't say that, think about the terrible disservice you're doing to all those other girls and women who are growing up needing some model, some guide, and actually do need to hear like it's a good thing to do this
Mm.
basic normal thing of raising a family. Like that's actually excellent, and your children will rise up and call you blessed, and like we should honor that. Like
Mm.
that's just something that we take all of that away from the majority of people, leave them with no guide, no honor in their regular lives, so that we can cater to like this tiny sliver of a minority that feels like offended and left out because they don't particularly fit into that model. It's like, well, guess what? Everybody doesn't fit into
Mm.
the model somehow. Like, get over yourself, live your life how you're going to want to live, and like accept that there is such a thing as normalcy, and it's actually really good.
Yeah, it's I don't know where this all came from. I'm not I'm not sure I've ever seen this in a society before where it's kind of flipped this way. So like the niche thing you do or the way you live your life works inside of the machine. And for some reason, people who are part of those groups have decided to destroy the machine from the inside out. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
it's like being I won't use the word parasite, but it's like being a bug or something that's symbiotic with another creature, or those birds that live on the backs of hippos or something like that. And all of a sudden, you're like, you know what? This hippo should be a bird. And you call your bird friends over to attack them. It's like, okay, what the fuck was the point of that, dude? Like
Right.
it seems like to me that non-normal people, if you want to call them that, or abnormal people or people,
Weirdos,
yeah,
goons,
weirdos or
crazy
whatever.
people. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They
Right.
just they they're very useful in moving us forward and thinking of new ideas. You know what I mean?
Right.
Particularly in the arts and sciences, especially in those two places, they move things forward quite a bit. I'm not sure we're going to have a lot of new discoveries about how to govern human beings. Frankly, I think we pretty much figured that out. But we've kind of flipped the script where it's like instead of those people standing out and being appreciated for what they provide, they've started to demand that everybody respect them and agree with them,
Right.
which is new.
Well, it's
I
like,
think that's new. I don't remember seeing that. I've studied history quite a bit. I don't remember ever seeing that particular thing before.
well, I think maybe the closest thing would be like the French Revolution or something. But you're
Mm,
right. I mean, it's a particularly American dysfunction because it's an excess of the democratic spirit, not of democracy, the government, the mode of government, but of that spirit that says everybody has to be the same. Everybody has to have all the exact same rights and privileges. Like that's not actually how it works. Like rights and responsibilities come connected. And by the way, like just as it's good and nice and healthy and joyful for most people to do what's normal, if you do happen to be one of the oddballs for whatever in whatever way, like a concert violinist or whatever, it's like it's actually better for you to be on the margin. Like the margins are a great place to be, but they don't exist if you destroy the normal the core of reality. There are no margins, so there's really no place for anybody. I mean, here's an example of this: is like, you know, the thing about me that is most abnormal, you might say, that is weirdest, is like I'm gay, and you look at like you talk about the advances that weird groups on the
mm,
outside make. It's like there's a lot of gay people in like musical theater, art, plays, whatever. Like they're very good artists for a
mm,
lot of history. A lot of Oscar Wilde is a classic
yep.
example, but like Stephen Sondheim, you can
Mm,
name any number. And it's like you think, well, why are they good? Like what's good about those guys? And one major part of it is that they are having to talk around or work around their exclusion from society. So
mm,
they're telling stories that are kind of at one remove. And that's just a really interesting angle. Like Tennessee Williams, you know, Streetcar Named Desire. You get these kind of very strange, oblique angles. It shows you something new. Now, look, I'm obviously very glad that like gay people are not being like persecuted
mm.
or stoned or whatever. That makes my life a lot easier and happier. But since that happened, musical theater, among other genres, has become crap because it's all these maudlin, like self-indulgent. It's like here, you know, here's my gay truth. It's like, well, maybe your gay truth isn't all that interesting to most people. Like maybe it was more interesting when you sort of used your vantage point on the outside to tell something about the inside. It's like all of this stuff can actually be very beautiful and good, but you have to accept that like if you're on the outside, you're going to be on the outside, and there's a cost, as you say, that comes with that.
Yeah, it's like that. God, what is that dick's name? I don't remember his name. Billy Eichner. That he makes
I
he
was just
makes
thinking about
this.
that movie Bros.
Yeah. He makes this movie about it's a gay romantic comedy. It's like, all right, cool. There's probably a lot of people that like that. I bet a lot of my female friends that hang around a bunch of gay dudes and get involved in their relationships would probably like that. But the average straight dude is not going to be interested in that. And that's look, you
Right.
shouldn't be offended by that. I'm not interested in eating Brussels sprouts either. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of stuff I like and a lot of stuff I don't like, and I just the impetus to demand people accept you is something new because I think that working towards the acceptance of society is a very productive thing. You know what I mean? Because in two ways. One, it keeps you within the guardrails of normal society so you don't act like a fucking asshole all the time. But two, you get to know people on an individual level and they discover that and this is how marriage equality happened in the United States. It wasn't because of any politician or any of that bullshit. It was because regular people started coming out publicly, and then folks started to recognize, like, oh, my friends and family members are gay, and they're just a normal person. Like, oh, okay, cool. I don't have to worry about that anymore.
Right.
That's not a weird thing to me now. But that's the process by which people jettison their prejudice is by personal. It's hard to hate up close, right? But if you're isolating yourself and then standing in the street to protest and blocking traffic and demanding people accept you, that will never work, ever. It'll never work. All it does is build resentment towards your community. And we're seeing it right now with all this transgender bullshit. And I see more and more gay people like, hey, leave us out of this shit, dude. We already did our thing. Like we're all set. Like, please leave us out of this.
Right. And we've got nothing to do with it. This is the other thing. I mean, the like bizarre leftist lie is that all of these things are sort of one. That's the point of that big acronym, right? The LGBTQIA plus star, whatever. It's like they're actually totally different things. They've got nothing to do with one another, except in the most sort of remote possible way. If you squint, like there's some similarities. But I completely agree with this stuff where they just like ram it down people's throats. What it actually does is the exact opposite of what it's supposed to do. I mean, this was the sheer audacity of Eichner. You know, he made that movie and he said like, well, this is a movie about how gay people are totally different from everybody else. And also, like, it failed at the box office because straight people refused to see it. It was like, well, why should they? You just told them they can never understand you. You just said that, like, they're totally clueless. So, okay, if I'm a straight person, I'm going to say, thanks very much. Not going to pay to see your movie in that case. And, you know, when instead you say, no, you actually have to, like, I'm going to pry your eyes open and make you look at the screen, or I'm going to come into your schools, worse even, right? And like talk to your kids about it. What do you think is going to happen? You're going to get people who say, well, actually, like, I was basically chill with like gay people wandering around. But if it's a choice between like getting called a homophobe on the one hand, or if I don't want to be called a homophobe, I have to let you into my children's middle school, elementary school to talk to them about their genitals. Well, call me a homophobe. Like that's what people are currently now saying, of course, because in reality, what this is all designed to do is tear us apart. It's not actually designed to bring us together. It's designed to set us against one another. That's the classic Marxist tactic. You divide people up. You sort of insist that everybody. I mean, one answer to your question, or to your sort of speculation about like where does this come from, why is this happening now, it's like this is a Marxist move, right? And it was actually done on purpose after the left kind of turned from economic critiques to cultural critiques of America. This is where we get our term white privilege, for instance. They sort of invented this idea of white skin privilege among communist circles to say that like white people can never fully be radicalized until they acknowledge their white skin privilege. And it's all designed to do one thing, which is unmake us as a country, which is to dissolve the ties of brotherly affection and friendship that bind citizens together. That thing that the Greeks would have called philia, friendship. It's all designed to just corrode that. It's like acid that they just pour on the citizenry, on our sense of ourselves as fellow Americans first and foremost. And so, of course, it's having that effect when they put it into the schools, because it was designed that way. Like, gay people weren't designed for that purpose. Even people with gender dysphoria weren't designed for that purpose. But the acronym LGBTQIA Borg was designed expressly for that purpose, to wield these people's pain and their exclusion and their feelings of doubt, to wield all of that as a cudgel against the 99% of people that basically just want to get along and be fine.
Sure. And I mean, first of all, rule number one is somebody's trying to divide you, they're trying to conquer you. That's how that works. That's why that phrase has existed for 5,000 years now. But this game plan is not new. And also a point, it's crazy how a child rapist like Foucault had so much influence on the modern West. Yeah. Jesus Christ, that is shocking to me. I'm sure that they don't teach that in their Marxist classes at the universities. But this particular style plan is not new. The phrase minority has been used for a very long time as a monolith to include anyone that's not white, anyone that's not straight, anyone whatever, right? Even to include women who have historically been the majority of populations, right? Which is pretty funny. Right. But now we're seeing it kind of progress in a different direction now, where certain Hispanic groups, most Asians, Jews are all lumped into white now, right? Because whiteness is a concept. It's not your skin color anymore. Although in schools we still tell white children that, you know, your family's bad, but whiteness is now this weird ephemeral concept, and it's very bizarre to me. And I'll never understand the minds of leftists that get duped by this stuff, but they seem to ascribe all the things about successful societies to whiteness, and then like this voter ID stuff where black people can't. For some reason, they can't figure out how to get IDs. I just don't know what it is. You know what I mean? Like, are you kidding me? That's horribly racist what you're saying right now. Because if you could just go ask a random black person if they have ID, they're like, yeah, I'm a human being, got ID. You know, it's I can't track that logic. It's very difficult for me to track that logic where it's not though. From the top down, it's very obvious what's happening there. As you said, intersectionality, all this stuff is just a device used to keep one group against the other and pretend you're on the aggrieved party's team. That's really what it's about, right? But for the individual at the lower level, the population level, I don't understand how people are so easily duped by this. And I guess we did spend quite a few years teaching people that they're victims, and maybe that has something to do with it. But it didn't just start 10 years ago. This stuff's been going on for a long time.
Oh, yeah. Well, it is what they call the long march through the institutions. I mean, that's a famous phrase from this moment when, you know, in the latter half of the 20th century, when the Marxist left basically decides that you're never going to divide Americans up by economic class, because at the time we had a robust, flourishing middle class. Capitalism was working pretty well for people. They actually weren't going to be led to discontent by those means, and so they had to be radicalized, consciousness raised according to these social grievances. And there they had actually a little bit of a stronghold because of this terrible part of our history that we had, slavery, right? Like that's like they actually hit upon something that genuinely is a sore spot, a wound, a problem in American history. It doesn't define us the way the left wants it to. It's not like the full description of who we are as a country, but it's a real thing. It's a serious, moral problem about our history. And so on the basis of that, basically took that one thing and just expanded it out to apply to everybody, so that the experience of slaves in America is now basically analogized to the experience of every other supposedly oppressed and exploited group. And right, I mean, like, whiteness as a concept is basically coming to mean like anything bad, but at the same time, it's also coming to mean like everything that functions about society, which just scares people away from wanting to endorse those things. But the guy currently sitting in the White House literally said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, right? That's like a real thing, and that comes right out of the 1619 playbook, right out of the Marxist playbook, that everybody to your right is essentially defined out of existence, doesn't get to participate in politics. They did the same thing to Peter Thiel when I think it was when he supported Trump. The Advocate, the gay magazine, said that Peter Thiel shows there's a big difference between men having sex with men and being gay or being queer or whatever. It's like, yeah, because these categories don't actually describe you. They're offered to you as if they're somehow going to help you to find, actualize, realize your true identity. They're not about you at all. They're political tools. They're things that they're conformity tools to make you fall in line. And if you don't fall in line, if you say anything bad, your token is going to get taken away. Your black card, your gay card, your woman card, whatever. You're not going to be a real one of any of those things unless you say exactly what they want you to say. It's like, that's not actually you trying to describe me or to make me flourish as who I am. That's you trying to erase me, dissolve me, control me, and use me as a pawn in your political project.
But doesn't it, I mean, it has to incontrovertibly turn into a 360-degree firing squad, right? Because intersectionality effectively ranks how offended everybody should be, and then sets them against each other in some kind of weird competition to see who's the most aggrieved party. That has to eventually, it's just based on the hierarchy or a hierarchical nature, and then the nature of human beings, that'll eventually turn into a fight against everybody's fighting everybody all the time. You know what I mean? And I think we're seeing more of that now. It's like the idea of a turf, for example, is the dumbest shit I've ever heard in my life. Those two things have nothing to do, like being a feminist and challenging the reality of somebody being a woman now that they cut their dick off. Those are two completely separate subjects, right? But somehow, again, we've combined these things into one idea, and it's mind-blowing to me. It is absolutely mind-blowing.
Well, right. I mean, the idea that, like, because you think that women should have like equal rights and equal pay, you therefore need to like change in the same room as Steve, who's still got an Adam's apple and a 5 o'clock shadow, is manifestly absurd. But the absurdity is part of the point. And I would even go further, I think, and say that, like, yeah, you're right. It does actually divide people against one another internally. Intersectionality becomes this 360-degree firing squad. It's been doing that for a while now, and that's by design, because the point is not to elevate or liberate or empower any of the people that are actually, being taught this stuff. The point is to turn those people against one another, make them feel constantly angry, constantly aggrieved, constantly at odds with their fellow man and woman and citizen, so that, as you said, they can be divided and conquered and controlled. Who's in the White House right now? Not like a disabled trans Black Latina veteran, a doddering old white man who has used the chaos created by wokeness to sail into power when he would otherwise be incapable even of like making a sandwich, let alone ruling a country. It's like, that's what this stuff actually cashes out in terms of, is just like power among a very small elite who are using this stuff to make people more and more rulable, more and more capable of submitting and becoming subjects rather than citizens.
Sure, but how do you maintain, I mean, so historically, the best way to maintain power is through patronage, right? You may call them bootlickers or whatever, but this has been going on forever, where the ruling classes have people within society, whether they're wardens of certain areas or the military or police or whatever it is, right? How long can you continue? Right. How long should you expect to be able to continue to rule if all of your patrons are set against one another? That seems like it's a good way to take control. I'm not sure if it's a good way to maintain it, though.
Yeah, well, this is that great, Machiavellian question. Is it better to be feared than loved? And what kinds of power are more stable than the others? In Aristotle's Politics, he makes a distinction between good and bad governments, which is not at all the distinction that like a modern American would reflexively make, because he says, look, monarchy can be good, aristocracy can be good, even rule by the people can be good. If you imagine that, it all has to do with where the love of the ruler is directed. If the ruler is ruling out of love of the people for their benefit, then you're basically going to get along fine. But if the ruler is ruling for his own self, then eventually you're going to create an unstable situation, and somebody's going to perform an uprising. And I do think that even though the Democratic Party, the left, the woke currently present this very sort of united front as if they're marching in lockstep, there's a lot of signs that there are actual, real, serious disputes and power struggles internally and within. I mean, I think we still don't know the answer to the question, like, who is actually in charge of the Biden White House? And it might be that the answer is different on every different day. Like, I know Obama is very involved, obviously commands a lot of respect and attention, but there's the Kamala party, there's the Michelle Obama party. Like, it's quite clear that there's a lot of disarray behind the scenes. And yeah, it can't last forever. It can do a lot of damage in the meantime. But you're right, this is an inherently unstable form of what the ancients would call tyranny. Tyranny is when the ruler rules for his own sake, his own benefit, his own enrichment, self-aggrandizement. And it's like Shakespeare shows in Macbeth. It's like it works for a while, and then eventually the ghosts come back to haunt you.
Sure, yeah. And it's, I like that idea of, I've talked about this a lot in the past in I guess a somewhat of a different way, but the way that a monarch might align their love. What I've said is, and it's mostly about Augustus, he had the same pathological ego that any emperor would, that you should expect from an emperor, right? Somebody, particularly one that was born in the purple, into a royal family in the first place. But he seemed to set his ego's true north to making Rome the best it could, function the best it could, things like that. And look, he did plenty of fucked up shit just like anybody else, but quite a bit different than Caligula or Nero, right? So it wasn't just about ruling; it was about having a good society from his perspective. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, because we are very romantic about democracy here, right? And I'm not opposed to that, certainly, obviously. I like individual. I think individual liberty is the most important principle in any system of government, because it's the ultimate inoculation against tyrannical bullshit, right? It's the consequence that's waiting in the winds for any kind of bad stuff to go down. But we have had. Can you tell me that 2023 America is adjusted for, I guess, societal inflation, if you want to call it that, or philosophical inflation, better than the Pax Romana, right? Comparatively, I'm not sure I can make that case, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is about incentive structures, which is kind of, I think, one of the things you're getting at there. And I think, yeah, you're absolutely right about this. And it's an important point. Like, you can say two things can be true at once. The Republic can be the best, justest, noblest form of government. I believe that. I think that the American Republic is structured as well as any government has ever been structured in the history of mankind, right? And at the same time, a decaying, decrepit republic that's been crusted over with corrupt bureaucracy and sort of taken over by bad men can be definitively worse than other forms of government if they're functioning well. Like, if you compare a republic at its worst to a monarchy at its best, like it's no contest. And one thing about that moment in Roman history that tragic, but in some ways potentially inevitable moment when the republic falls and the empire comes in, is it is about incentive structures. It's about Augustus ego, his kind of imperial ambition, aligning with making things go really well, and basically bringing a lot of stability after years and years, generations of civil war. Another way in which incentive structures worked against Rome, it was in the case of Caesar, because if you got this guy, this tremendously ambitious, successful general, smart guy, right, huge ambition, cries at the tomb of Alexander the Great because he hasn't accomplished as much as Alexander had, just this big appetite, the kind of appetite that builds civilizations, right, that male drive to conquer and succeed. And there's no place in society, in the sort of structure of the Roman Republic as it is, for him to exert that ambition. There's nowhere for him to go. Roman had a bunch of guys like this. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were really the first ones that just, these soldiers, these generals were coming home and finding such a gridlock and such a kind of dead civilization that there was nowhere for all that ambition to go, to build. And that's a really dangerous situation. If you don't have a place for your young, ambitious men to excel and be honored for excelling, you're going to get some bad scenarios right down the line. It's one reason why, by the way, like a guy like Elon Musk, even though I have a lot of like heebie-jeebies about Neuralink and some of his sort of ideas about the human mind, I find him a really encouraging figure just because he's got he has a goal. He has like a thing that he wants to do. He wants us to go into space. He wants us to be like technologically awesome. It's like, at least that's a thing that I could imagine us actually doing. It would make a difference. And like people with ambition could like pour their ambition into that, because otherwise it just turns inward and it tears you apart, which is currently a lot of what's happening. Is just the frustration of noble spirits, noble characters who have nowhere to go and are actually basically being told that they suck. For all the things that make them sort of noble and manly and heroic are actually oppressive and toxic and wrong.
Sure, and that inevitably turns into nihilism, no matter where it happens. I've seen it in Middle Eastern terrorism. I've seen it in school, like white and Hispanic school shooters in America. I've seen it in in black inner city gang violence. It manifests itself in a lot of different ways, but is the same symptom of the same disease, right? And it is a disease of we made the wrong decision. We were right that something was wrong, that masculinity, there was a problem with masculinity. I guess not a problem with it, but there was a masculinity related problem. And for some reason, a large swath of people decided, oh, well, masculinity must be bad. And that's obviously stupid, right? I mean, that's just, I can't even address how dumb that is, but there was a problem. Well, the problem was that we weren't directing it. I mean, it's like, it's a wildfire and you have to put it in the right place for it to be effective.
Totally. I mean, many people have pointed this out before me, but it's like, it wasn't a problem with masculinity. It was actually a deficiency of masculinity. Correct. I mean, masculinity that is, not tutored, is not directed, is not cultivated. That's, subpar manhood. It's like, it's the raw materials without the full development. You might say that's like, it's like a sapling that hasn't grown into a tree yet, now is being kind of twisted and deformed, so it's stunted, so it doesn't grow. And we've done this in so many places, not just in, the relationship between the sexes. We've done it with our country, right, which had these, as we've now discussed, like some problems, and was then condemned as like evil per se. But there's such an inherent illogic in that, because the very values you're using to condemn the past came to you from the country. Like, this country is why we believe that all men are created equal. Like, it's the founders that taught us that, And so it's like, so now we say, well, you did wrong to have slaves because all men are created equal. It's like, right. So what you're saying is that there was a deficiency in America, not that America was bad, but that it wasn't America enough. Correct. It's like the same thing is true of manhood. It's like, you look at men that do evil things, wrong things, bad things. You talk about veterans coming home and being treated as if they're somehow broken or in need of coddling. It's like, so you look at that and you say manhood is bad. You say, no, actually, there's not enough manhood. There's not enough manliness. It's not cultivated enough. We don't pay enough attention to it. We ought to be doing a whole lot more to encourage it.
Or at least trying to generate, in the same way that we would react to creative destruction and try to find new avenues of employment for people, finding new avenues for masculinity to be exercised in an appropriate way would have been the right choice, and not to tell little boys that they're evil because they have testosterone. That's stupid. This has been a really good conversation. Tell me about the book.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks. The book is called How to Save the West, and the subtitle is Ancient Wisdom for Five Modern Crises, and it is based on that radical idea that the past has something to say to the present. So we talked today about all sorts of problems that seem very new, that seem kind of out of left field, crazy, unprecedented. But we've also talked about a million ways in which those problems actually force us back to basics. They require us to reinvest in the fundamental questions like, is there such a thing as true and false? What is a human being? What's our relationship to God and the universe? And those questions have been around forever, and that means we're not alone. We have this entire company of witnesses, this enormous tradition called the Western canon to dig into, as we've been doing here today. So I think if people like the conversation we've been having, they'll really love this book. It's How to Save the West. It's everywhere that books are sold.
Good. Yeah, I just bought the audiobook. So if you see a deposit going to
Nice.
your account, that was me. Um,
Thank you, sir.
yes, sir.
Appreciate it. And I should say that I read the audiobook myself. If anybody is interested,
Yeah,
people sometimes ask that.
you got to
I
these
do it
days.
myself.
Like if I honestly,
Yeah.
if I bought the book and it was some British dude, I was going to be pissed. So I'm glad that you did it yourself.
Well, it's me with a British accent.
Oh yeah,
So
well,
that's
that's fair. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media, about your show and everything before we get out of here.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am at Spencer Klavan on Twitter for my sins. And that's the easiest place to find me. I've also got a bunch of links there for my mailing list and all that good stuff. And you can also read what I write at the Claremont Review of Books, which is the publication where I am an editor. And that's a good place to find me as well.
Awesome. Spencer Klavan, thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, my friend. It was a
Yes,
blast.
sir.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.